I am so happy to have Ira again here today because we always enjoy talking to each other about Austrian economics and other um, aspects of the Jordan Peterson world. And recently we had some email exchange about Whittaker Chambers' book, Witness, and also Ludwig von Mises's book, Human Action. And so we're going to discuss those a little bit, but as I was refreshing my memory again about von Mises and going back and rereading Chambers' book, Witness, which is just one of the most painfully beautiful books I have ever read, I was struck by the similarities between Peterson's thinking and von Mises' thinking and Chambers' thinking. Not that they're the same in everything, but there are certain similarities. And one of them that I saw that is absolutely similar is their commitment to action. And so I know, Ira, you wanted to talk a little bit about what drew you to those two authors, to Chambers and to von Mises. And so I'll let you get started and then I'll throw in some stuff later on.
Well, yeah, I thought, in the sense of one of the aspects of both of them, especially Witness, the book, and then the book Human Action, is they're big books. I mean, literally big books with big ideas. But so it's a sense of going through the history of, for me, of how I came to know even about them. For both of them, I think today are pretty obscure. Mm-hmm. In their days, had quite a bit of fame in different, or infamy in different ways. So here is my copy of Witness. This one I didn't read this copy. I had a paperback. Yeah. But to give you a sense of this, and I read it, started to read it when I was in graduate school, because I started reading National Review. So mm-hmm. National Review was Bill Buckley's magazine that started in the 50s, or the conservative answer to left-wing communism and things. And when I was younger, I had a real kind of a fanboy feeling for Buckley, which I would say I don't necessarily maintain now. But at that time, my advisor, where I'd seen Buckley on TV, but I really didn't know anything of the real background or history. I was watching something called Firing Line, mm-hmm. which they're still trying to keep that up on PBS or not, but was for many years. And, sort of recognized somebody with this intelligence and well-read, and I was attracted to that. And my advisor, though, we started talking about things, and this is an mechanical engineering, so it was nothing to do with the subject. We started talking about things a little bit political, but I wasn't very political at all. He started bringing in his copies of National Review, and I started to read it. And from National Review, I started to learn the history also of the magazine and the milieu. And Whittaker Chambers was part of that. And so Witness, now it's been a long time since I read it, and also a long time since I did a lot of other reading of Chambers and things about him. And just in that sense, Witness, I would say, is a sense of he's famous for being a witness against a kind of a communist spying conspiracy, but in particular about a man named Alger Hiss, who was a high-ranking State Department official or government official. And out of nowhere, he accused him of being a spy. And so that's his witness. But I think the other side of this, which Karen, I think maybe you've caught on, is his witness to being a Christian. I think is also there. And
well, maybe before we go on, I just want to read one little passage because I think it's one of the most beautifully written things I've ever read. And it's in the foreword to the book where as he's writing the foreword, he's writing this to his children who are still quite young, to kind of forewarn them about what's going to be coming, because he knew he was going to be very controversial. He knew that his life as he knew it was over for taking on this behemoth that he was fighting against. And so he's writing this forward to his children. And at the very end of the forward, he says this. I don't know if I can read it without crying. My children, when you were little, we used sometimes to go for walks in our pine woods. In the open fields, you would run along by yourselves, but you used to instinctively give me your hands as we entered those woods, for it was darker, lonelier, and in the stillness, our voices sounded loud and frightening. In this book, I am again giving you my hands. I am leading you, not through cool pine woods, but up and up, a narrow defile between bare and steep rocks from which in shadow things uncoil and slither away. It will be dark, but in the end, if I have led you aright, you will make out 3 crosses, from 2 of which hang thieves. I will have brought you to Golgotha, the place of skulls. This is the meaning of the journey. Before you understand, I may not be there. My hands may have slipped from yours. It will not matter, for when you understand what you see, you will no longer be children. You will know that life is pain, that each of us hangs always upon the cross of himself. And when you know that this is true of every man, woman, and child on earth, you will be wise.
Yeah, so this is why, I loved Witness. And as I recall from those days, that's also a time when I was forming ideas about becoming a Christian. And so a lot of those things, were in my mind, and I was not well read at the time. I think now I'm relatively well read, but I could see that this was really great literature. Just the writing, and going farther with that theme. Chambers was an editor at Time magazine, and Time at that time was a great magazine with great writers. I mean, it's really fallen on hard times. And also Chambers was the one who translated Bambi into English. It was another one of these things. He was a really great intellectual, as well as somebody who had been a spy. I mean, this whole thing with Hiss, and what are the aspects of the story? You hear different things, but in terms of Hiss being the spy, there was the classic thing of Chambers holding on to some of the papers that he had microfilm that he had stolen when he was working as a spy, and he hid them on his farm in a pumpkin. And this is where he had the pumpkin papers that he delivered, like it says bombshell evidence. And this was one of the, like today we go through who's telling the truth. And in the end, Hiss was convicted not of being a spy, but of what was it? Not telling the truth in the court. The name, the word is mine.
Perjury.
Perjury. And in the last aspect of the historical aspect of the story, as I know it, in the 90s, when the archives of some of the Soviet papers were opened, researchers there found the Venona papers, or no, that was actually or maybe I'm mistaken, maybe that was the ones that the US had broken their code. But in any case, in this internal Soviet documentation, there's what scholars have said that, Hiss was certainly working for Stalin, and was, at some of the big conferences with Roosevelt. He was there passing information and things like that.
Well, to me, that's one of the most interesting things about the whole story, is that at the time it was controversial because the powers that be and the elite did not want to acknowledge that this kind of thing was going on. And so they didn't want to listen to Chambers. And actually, the first time he went to the government to tell them that he had been a spy and wanted to name names of other people who had worked with him, they didn't even do anything about it for almost 10 years. And it wasn't until that some congressional hearings started up that they came back and grabbed hold of him and said, hey, we think you have something to tell us. And so the same thing happens today, that there are these things that are so evidently true, and yet the powers that be don't want it to be known. And so even today they're saying, oh yeah, Alger Hiss was not guilty. You know, there's a refusal to acknowledge it, even though all this proof is there, because they don't want it to be known. And so they're very good at hiding it. I mean, it's.
Yeah, I haven't been keeping up like with what's would come out like in the history profession. You know, if this incident came up, what a professional historian would say about it. There was a time, and I'll explain more. You know, there's the aspect of this book. This particular copy was given to me by a good friend who did his PhD in English at Duke, where I was, and then, but he was, you know, in the milieu. He started like as a non-tenure track job, you know, teaching witness, which I say, you know, we agreed was, you know, this great literature. But of course, if you're teaching witness, and you're white or, you know, whatever, you know, you have no chance to get a tenure track job in academia today. Yeah. You know, there's that sense of what the academics might be saying. Just to bring up another book, because this is Whittaker Chambers, a nice book of his journalism.
Oh, I didn't know about that. That looks fabulous.
Ghost on the Roof. And this refers to him thinking about, writing about like the Tsar's ghost, seeing how Stalin had finally consolidated the Russian Empire that they always had wanted. You know, those were the ghosts on the roof of, say, Potsdam, or I forget exactly where it was, but this is, you can see some of, again, his wonderful writing in this book.
Well, that was part of his history too, was that when he was working at Time, he eventually worked up to become editor of the Foreign Affairs page, which there were a lot of enemies that didn't want him to have that role because they didn't want what was happening in Soviet Union to be known to the American people, because they had been able to keep that under wraps for a long time. The journalists had kind of buried the disaster that was going on in the Soviet Union, but he wanted to make it known.
Is there some little bit of noise in the with my family?
Well, I don't know. We just barely hear it here. It's no problem for us. Yeah.
Okay. Well, definitely, it's true, and you know, I think, you know, what was the nature of the power balance in terms of the competing teams, or whatever you want to call it, in the U.S. at that time. One thing certainly was it wasn't nearly so centralized as it is today. So you had, say, the Chicago Tribune or other places where there were local papers and other things, as opposed to now where it seems really to be one voice. You know, you see these clips now and then where 50 different presenters will have the same line, you know, as they
yeah.
particular subject. So yeah, we're in the ups and downs of that era, you know, again, are interesting examples for what you know, what is going on today. Just to continue my kind of story with this and leading on to what we can, actually, it's a little bit disturbing for me. So can I just hold on for 1 second?
Sure, let me just put it on pause.
Okay, so well, back where we were in terms of, you know, an interesting time for me there, where I was, you know, reading through a lot of these kind of learning about these things. I didn't really take much history in school, and didn't really, this history is not usually taught in school, actually. And through it are also different things with Buckley. And this was a real nice book for me. It's called, with Chambers, called Odyssey of a Friend. So this was put together by Buckley, but is the letters from Chambers. And this, one of the things that struck me about Buckley at that time, as you'd hear different people talking about him, was personally how interesting he was, say, or as a great friend. Now, again, I think I would change that subject, my feeling on that a little bit, as I know more about his role in different controversies, say. But at the time, this book certainly struck me a lot. I mean, what also, you know, the oldies, what a letter could be like. I don't know how many people today write letters, but, you know, even reading books of old letters, of how as a way of communicating, it brings so much to what your everyday life is, you know, to be writing down, sort of like keeping a journal, but as you're giving it to somebody else, that description, I think, also has kind of a special meaning. And from that, well, all these books, all this thing with Buckley, and just my kind of going to the library in those days. So I would go to the library, and at the Duke Library one day when I was in there, they had a display of books by different people who had donated something to the library. So they were friends of the library. And something like, what is your favorite book? And one of them was the latest book by Buckley. And it was written by, you know, this was a little note. This is by a woman who was I'm a friend of Bill Buckley, and his latest book is my favorite book, and used to work with him. And who lived in Durham, North Carolina, where I was. And I go, oh man, I was so interested in that milieu, you know, just sort of the culture around the magazine and the writers and what their history was, you know, again, from reading things like Witness, and there were several others, James Burnham and Buckley, etc. And so, oh, it'd be really interesting to talk to somebody who's like a secretary or something, but still what it would be like. And I, you know, went to the library, says, this person around? Oh yeah, you can, here's her number, you can call her. So I ended up calling this woman, and we became friends. Now, you know, it was a funny, I mean, real kind of a friendship, but we were 40 years difference in age. You know, she was 70 something and I was 20 something. But it brings up the other topic of our conversation. So this is a book by Margit von Mises, the wife of Ludwig von Mises, kind of a little memoir of the life with this guy who's actually, Ludwig was kind of a strange guy in different ways, you know. And there's a bit there on page 159, if I just take a second, you know, my husband, due to his books and lectures, had a far-reaching influence and extended to our wide circle of friends. Lou took great interest in Dr. J.B. Matthews, the well-known anti-communist. During the 1950s and early 1960s, Matthews and his wife, Ruth, often included us in their parties, which were gatherings for many conservatives. For a brief period in the 1930s, Dr. Matthews had been a fellow traveler, a term he popularized when he became a staff member of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. As a turning point in his life, JB wrote in a moving letter of gratitude to Lou how much he was influenced by his writing. Dr. Matthews fought for socialist trends in the United States until his death in 1966. Over the years, Ruth became one of my best and most loyal personal friends, and still is today. So Ruth Matthews was the woman who I met there in Durham, and we became friends. And
Wow.
right at that, this was early in the first Bush administration.
Mhm.
And it was a time where there was a lot of economic and tax questions and things like this. And I had never taken an economics course, and I knew kind of basics of it, but it wasn't on my mind. So, or it was on my mind, who says like, I couldn't understand this, because if you had any kind of memory and followed the news, you would see that most of what was described as, an economist being on TV or the newspaper or working in the administration or working for the opposition, the Democrats at that time, was wrong about whatever they predicted. It's just the predictions never seemed to come through and it didn't make sense. And so, well, it came to my mind kind of as a point of study. If I'm going to I want to read some economics to try to figure out what's going on, to try to understand this. And on Ruth's table was this book, Human Action by Ludwig von Mises. And I picked it up, a treatise on economics. It was more like this, it's gotten all worn out, but it's a treatise on economics, the book cover. And I kind of said, again, this is, several months, to read it kind of thing, but it was, this was my first foray into economics through Ruth, was through kind of Buckley, in that line. And, she was an incredibly interesting person in her own right and had a PhD in sociology, and the whole story of her and her husband is something that maybe we could talk about another time. But I think is very interesting enough to have done a lot of research and study into that as well. But this brought me, to Human Action and the whole Austrian School of Economics. And probably one of the very first things that I found, that really, really struck me was the specific interdiction of making these mathematical predictions. That they were something, maybe you can do some extrapolation from historical data, but it has no fundamental principled meaning into understanding what the economics will be in the future. In some historical setting, you might find a little data. And in von Mises' day, his great fight was sort of the German historical school of these people that basically said, well, there's data and only data. And you'll see that with the positivists, which was Ernst Mach. Von Mises came from, obviously Austrian economics was from Vienna in that magical period, from the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, where the intellectual artistic life in Vienna was just incredible. In terms of, obviously it was people like Freud, Stefan Zweig, Mach, was there, and they would have these different, like von Mises, never got kind of the job in the university, but would have their own kind of schools, where they would meet seminars, they call them, where they would meet once every week or 2 weeks or some regular level. And somebody would present, and then they'd discuss the issues, and they'd go all into the night. And this was another interesting aspect just of von Mises, is to go back into that historical period of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and those characters who were there, which it is really amazing,
one of the things that I was just in preparation for this, I was watching a documentary about von Mises that talked about his desire when he was first starting to think about these things. He noticed the error in the German school, in the critical thinking, the German school of critical thinking. He noticed the error there. And that was one of the things that led him to begin to get interested in this whole issue of human action as the important element in economic systems, that it's not these models that you can come up with or using historical data or any of those things, but it's strictly, humans act, and then humans rank order their priorities according to value, which is, that's Jordan Peterson 101, right?
Yeah, and it certainly
and then the next step for the economics is that the way that humans vote on their rank order priorities is with their money. And that's precisely why socialism and communism don't work, because that piece gets left out, and that voting option is not available anymore. And so there's no way for the economy to have the information that it needs to function.
Well, in the historical sense of ideas, von Mises, one of von Mises' great works, pre-Human Action, when he was again still in Vienna, was a 1920 book that was a critique of socialism.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the things they talked about.
Based on, it's called, the fundamental thing was the calculation problem. So that is, how do you distribute, how do you utilize your limited resources? So, the ideas start from human action, human act to relieve something. If everything was perfect, you wouldn't do anything. You'd just be sitting there essentially. And humans act, and it comes to that is through those actions, they provide information about what they need or what they want, or however how you mix those. That he specifically talks about the difference between not getting into the psychological problem that's there that you could end up doing. Maybe the modern cog science could get to some of those fundamentals of how that works out from the brain, like a physicist could figure out particle physics to describe something downstream that's more macro. But for him, it was the sense, it doesn't matter if what's going on in the brain, even if it's be called mental illness, there's still the fundamental logical step of it's something's needed, uneasiness of some kind to cause that action. Otherwise,
the way Jordan Peterson talks about it in Maps of Meaning is, and this is at the very start of his book, there's 4 things you need to know: what there is, what to do about what there is, how is that going on? The third one always baffles me, because the fourth one is, how do we know the difference? Oh, the third one is that there is a difference between what there is and what to do about what there is. And then the fourth one is, what is the difference between what there is and what to do about what there is? And later on, he frames it a little bit more simply. I'm here, I want to get there. And the reason I want to get there is that it must be better than where I am, which means that where I am is not
more of what von Mises, I would say, my interpretation again of something I've read a long time ago, but fundamental axioms say, humans act. They don't just sit. Why do they act? Because they have some need, or it could be a psychological need. I mean, could be hunger, could be whatever, the physical need, whatever it is.
And fundamentally, that's based on value, right? I mean, that's also what von Mises talked about, is that they rank order based on value, which is Jordan Peterson's big thing, because I don't want to make this political, but there are just 2 different ways of looking at the world. And one way of looking at the world is that everything is relative. There is no right or wrong. There is no, this is better than that. Everything is relative. And Jordan Peterson always makes the argument, the world won't function if that's how you see things, because you won't move, you won't act. If you don't see a difference between where you are and where you want to go, there will be no action. And I think that's fundamentally what von Mises was saying, isn't it?
I think pretty close. I mean, I think you can get into some nuance there that could be a little bit different, but the essential is the aspect of ranking is I would say is a little bit downstream, maybe just a little bit. You have to have to act because something's not doing that action. You might have several. You have to rank the several things that you don't like to the point you're going to act on the one you do think is the most important, based on what is possible that you think is possible to do and what the action might be. You might be hungry and cold. Do I go get food or I go get warmth? I mean, for example, I mean, in a very simple way of looking at it. So that being the case, building on those fundamental axioms and, marginal theory of value, as you have more things, they become less valuable to you. If you need a refrigerator, you have one. By the time you have 10 refrigerators, it's not so valuable to you. There's several of these kind of things that you can look at the way the world is logically, not quantitatively, not by looking historically, but just purely by recognizing, yes, if I have more of it, it'll become less valuable to me. How much is always the question. Is my 10th refrigerator worth 1/10 of the first refrigerator, or 1/100th, or whatever? But it will be worth less. Certainly won't be worth more. All else being equal, kind of thing. So building on that, these kind of fundamental axioms, he made the argument that the only way to create a economy, the economy that's incredibly complicated. So for example, you could go back to a classic essay by Leonard Reed called I, Pencil.
Yeah, that's so great.
Something as simple as a pencil is so incredibly complex. Nobody could figure out how to do it, make it economically. So something happens in terms of how that's done. And that's done by the sense of the information that's coming from each of the actors. They're not only saying what they want, but they're also recognizing what's needed or what there's too much of or too little of. And all those things go through the market is the computer that goes up for entrepreneurs to then determine what is the way to utilize scarce resources. And he predicted that socialist systems would always collapse because in the end, this information flow wasn't there. Even if you had the greatest computer, like right now you say, well, but today we have AI, it could be everywhere. The big thing with the socialists was, Marx was the end of money, where money was like the calculator to rank the values between the apples and oranges, say, and put them together. But if you didn't have the market, individuals at that particular time making all those decisions, it couldn't work. That's the information generating place. Once you take them out and you have a top-down system that's imposing things, like imposing healthcare today. How do you deal with anything? It's a top-down method for what will be happening. Things will go out of hand and eventually collapse, or at least a sense they won't provide whatever the top-down planner is saying they're trying to do. Now, there may be some cynical thing that they don't care. They just,
Well, and the
system.
level
But in
of
terms
care
of-
will no longer relate to the cost. The pricing system is all off because,
But that could be one of the things.
when you pay $25 for a box of tissues at the hospital, for example, everything has gotten out of kilter because the decisions are being top down rather than, I've told this story before. I remember before Medicare, my dad was hospitalized one time and he got the bill. It came to him personally. And he looked through that bill, man. He looked through every single line item. And if there was something he didn't like, he called the hospital and personally talked to them and got it changed. Well, when Medicare takes care of everything, nobody's looking at the bill.
Yeah, no, there's lots of aspects of that, in terms of, again, I would say grifting, the people taking money out of the system, whatever. Yeah. But it's much more fundamental to that of, say, there's a top-down system that says how much of the resources go toward making people healthy by building gyms or something, or, having them eating better food. A vaccine is the solution, the only solution to a pandemic, as opposed to other methods to do it, or that how many ICU beds are there? It's not coming somewhere. There's a planner out there saying, this was one of the ones that I liked, is that people go, oh, the ICU beds are full. And he said, well, what do you think they planned them to be? 50% full? They're planned to be as charged as possible and then maybe do something, because otherwise they'd be wasting resources. But that's the top-down thing about still, or mid-level kind of planning at a hospital. But it's still the sense of, again, in the hospital, they know what they're paid for. So they're paid for ICU stays, so they probably have maybe a lot more ICU beds than really are necessary of what's really needed in, for different types of critical care, or whatever they're calling critical care, who they're going to put in critical care. In other words, when the place is empty, they might put anybody in clinical care if Medicare will pay for it, because it's a lot more, what the resources are. Oh, all those things coming together, we could try to parse any individual industry or product or anything else. But this fundamental rule, I think, fundamental observation of the way the world is, it's maybe a Pageauian pattern, that if you don't allow information to flow up, you'll have a collapse. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the sense of that 1920 treatise, one of his great contributions to the understanding of economics. The other thing that he
well, go ahead, and then after you finish that, then I want to bring it back to Chambers for just a second.
Okay, well, I think that's again, we can go on a long time more about von Mises, I think, in a couple of ways. One is his contributions to economics, but also more generally in terms of history and other understanding history. He has a very good book on the theory of history, I think, and his life, which also has interest, the way Chambers' life also was interesting, and then maybe where they intersect in the 50s and 60s in New York.
Yeah, I would like to get to that, but when you're still back there on socialism, I wanted to bring up the in Whittaker Chambers' book, he talks about the great battle. And in his mind, the great battle was the battle between freedom and control. And obviously that's where you get down to when you get to socialism and communism. It's a battle between freedom and control. But the thing that I found so interesting is that when you go through and you read just many of the kind of, Chambers is very good at looking at a very complicated world environment and breaking it down into very simple principles that he could see so clearly. But he only saw it clearly because he had lived inside the communist system for such a long time, and he had participated in it, and he had given his whole life to it because he believed in it, because he believed that everybody needs something that they're willing to live for and something that they're willing to die for. And one of the reasons that communism was so successful was that it gave people that ideal, right?
I think he certainly, well, just to say is that I took witness, and those letters, a great empathy for people. He had a real sense of that, as opposed to, I think, other communist revolutionaries or other type of people who get involved in these kind of movements. He did have a sense he needed to be doing something for people in that kind of a benevolent way, I would say.
Well, yeah, he really struggled with the lives that he knew that he would damage by going and speaking up, because he had known these people and he cared about
including his. And I've seen places where they have tried to make the case that there might have been a homosexual relationship between them, for example. So there are more layers to it, and this is why he wouldn't want to. He spoke often that this was the special person, a very, very special person in his life, in witness. But what in 1952 or whatever that was written, how would you express something that might have been a homosexual relationship at the time.
I'm not buying that, not based on the way the rest of the book is written. I don't buy that.
Well,
But the thing I wanted to say was when he talks about this paradigm of freedom versus control, I'm having an email conversation at the same time with Bionic Mosquito about natural law, and
very good. Yeah, that's, I think,
yeah,
an important part of the story.
Yeah, he was making a point about the way the world is today. We have a problem with two different kinds of groups of people. One group wants to control. They want to develop their own utopian ideal of the way the world should be, and then they want to make everybody fall in line under it, and they want control. And then the other group is the people that don't want any boundaries at all. They want to get rid of all the boundaries. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, I think what's actually happening there is that you have the people who want to control, and then the people that don't want any boundaries, they're the people who want someone else to control them. They can't control themselves, so they want someone else to control. They want to give all the responsibility to somebody else. And so they're willing to just knuckle under, bend their knee and say, okay, if you'll take care of me, you can have all the control. So that's a super dangerous pot of people. One group wants to control. There's a whole bunch of other people who want to say, okay, you control, that's fine, I'll just do my thing. And that is also a picture of the way communism was. Back when Chambers was battling against communism, there were the people who were the elite that were fighting to be in control because they wanted the world to crumble. They wanted to be able to take over. But there were also a whole lot of other people who believed in communism because they didn't want to have personal responsibility. They wanted somebody else to take the reins so that they, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. It's easy to grift if you're on the need side, right? You don't have to do anything. Somebody else is going to provide for you. So it was exactly the same problem that we have today, except back then it was called communism, and today it's something else. But in the introduction to Witness, Novak is writing, and he's saying there was only one place where Chambers was wrong in Witness. And that's when Chambers says, by leaving communism and going to the other side, I knew that I was joining the losing side because I believed that communism would win. And Novak said, see, he was wrong because in 1989, the wall went down and communism didn't win. But it's like a hydra. It keeps coming back. Why is that it keeps coming back? And why are people so ready to let someone else come in and control? What is it in us that is willing to let that kind of thing happen over and over and over again in history?
Yeah, that's a deep question, certainly, and maybe there's not one answer in the sense, individual places and times have different aspects of how that process occurs. Maybe, the other side is to look at maybe the less often times where people have been relatively free and controlled their lives. How many of those are there? We can look to that to say, this was a time when there was human flourishing, say, or how much human flourishing there was, to what level and how deep that would be. So one of the places I've thought for a long time, and it's maybe getting into the depth of these different work, but then you see it in the Bionic Mosquito, for example's writing, is in the medieval period, which the Renaissance term totally horrible and nothing good, but if you study it at all, you see how much more there is. This is C.S. Lewis' Divine Image, and I just saw Jonathan Pajot did an interview with a Russian novelist who's getting to the medieval mind and where they were able to progress in many different fields and we're talking about Europe now, so set the stage for the scientific revolution and these other kind of revolutions in various ways. Certainly in economics, you see the precursors of the Austrian school in Salamanca and other places in Spain in the 16th century. So there is something there about what do people recognize as why to be free. And certainly from a Christian standpoint, we could say, what is it? It's having God on top. And that way there's no group of people on top.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where, once you make that change, most of the other societies, again, I'm not an expert on those, we can go through and look at them, the emperor, the king, the whoever was a god. So, that was the top of the hierarchy. In the West, especially, you had the god and even a separate organization to compete with the governmental, say, state organization for this ultimate power. And also the sense of each individual having value. To me, this was an historical aspect of Jesus's life, that he brought that idea into the world, that each individual has value, that again, to me, argues against a elite, now a technocratic elite, deciding everything for everybody, which seems to be the goal at the moment.
Well, the other thing I was thinking about in this terms of each individual having value is that it's through those individual choices, individual actions, that the information that is necessary for the flourishing of the society can be discovered. Each individual has their experience, they gain in knowledge and information and wisdom, and then they bring that back to the group. But if that, Jordan Peterson is always saying that we meet the transcendent when we err, or we meet the transcendent when we come to the limits of our knowledge. So we're getting wisdom and knowledge from the transcendent when we make a mistake. We find out we're not aligning up with reality, and so we have to change something. So that gives us new information. But if you're in the communist system and you make a mistake, I don't think there's any forgiveness. I think if somebody makes a mistake in the communist system, off with your head, which means you're not bringing the new information back in that comes out of those errors.
I guess it could be. I mean, again, you go to details of, what kind of mistakes and where are the mistakes made, in terms of who loses their head. So in the sense of how decisions are made and false decisions, that is a false view of reality. And this gets me back to my original view. Is like, if I make a false calculation as an engineer, the plane won't fly or will crash. Thing. When the economy crashes, the people who are making those decisions that drove it to crash, say at the Federal Reserve, well, they're not seem to ever be blamed for anything.
Yeah.
So certainly the people at the bottom who then don't have enough to eat, I mean, they're suffering, and suffer in those more direct political ways that the extreme level of terror in different communist countries at different times, but probably more often is just more of this general degradation of society all the way through on a regular basis for everybody. Just
when people don't bear the consequences of their mistakes, you mean?
Yeah, who bears them? I mean, it's the sense of certainly society was bearing them. When a higher official bears the consequences is another question, and when that cosmic justice maybe will be brought to bear on different people, is one of those things to think about it in times like these. I think.
Well, I was thinking a little bit more of the kind of like some of the the communist operatives that Chambers was working with, they did not have much incentive to innovate. They just followed the rules, because
Yeah.
if they would innovate and make a mistake, they might end
Right.
up their whole family getting,
But-
all of them getting thrown.
But I think in terms of
prison
what the dangers are, for that situation. But when I see that, the pattern that I see and put it all the way through, and actually I could bring up another subject related to this, another book, and then I'll come around to this. It'll take a little bit of
Okay.
a while, but this is a really nice book on von Mises. It's a biography, but it's also by George Guido Hulsmann. Hulsmann, I would say, is the very, very top of practicing Austrian economists today. And now he's a professor in France, actually, at Angers. And this is a great book for von Mises' life, but also for understanding more of the ideas and the milieu of the ideas that von Mises developed. And the interesting thing I'd say about that is because Hulsmann, for a time, started a seminar, on the model of von Mises in Paris, and I attended a few of those when I could. It's been a long time, several years since I have been able to. But in one of them, there was a student presenting a argument about the bureaucracy that's very much what you just described as one kernel of the aspect of this is what happens, to the bureaucrat. They'll never innovate. Any innovation's more risky than just going along with whatever. So you just keep on making the same mistakes over and over again, for example, or whatever it happens to be. Take the top-down information and that's it. There's no emergent information because there's no value for the middle bureaucrat. And my point at the time was I was working, at a big company, and that bureaucratic mentality was also very much evident in a major corporation. What's the level where that stops? It could be as small as a couple hundred, maybe the largest organization, human organization you can have, like the original tribe, say, before the innovation gets snuffed out, by the organizational hierarchy, unless something is really, but what happens is the hierarchy needs to be renewed and changed and split off. This is maybe the creative destruction of a Schumpeter, you might say, is necessary in some level, and not that the hierarchy changes where God is on top, but there's some human hierarchies. I would say maybe even within the church, say the Catholic Church or other churches, to avoid these fundamental kind of problems that seem to just, within the work environment, I see often where even higher level managers will recognize this stifling of everything and try to come up with some new kind of gadget program. There's a team that's gonna, I would be interested to know the real history, say, of the skunk works somewhere, if they really were able to be independent and survive before the bureaucracy eventually pulling them back in. And
well, I remember back in the early
managers.
90s when I first moved to California, I was working as a consultant. Basically, I was training companies how to deal with their foreign employees and training the foreign employees how to deal with being in an American company. So I'd have to go into the company and understand their corporate culture very deeply so I could come back to my students and explain the corporate culture to them. And the Intel corporate culture at that time had what they called their 7 core values. And one of their core values was you speak truth to power, and that there would be no consequences if you called somebody on a mistake. And that was their value. That was the theory. I don't know how well it actually worked out.
Well, it's like Google's never do evil.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, well, they could keep that up.
And no kidding.
It's very difficult, like I say, there's a cultural aspect of being in the hierarchy. And as you have production that's bigger and bigger, you end up with layers and layers. And I don't see how you get away with, how you kind of defeat this totally. So in other words, if I was a high level manager, like the CEO, I would try to come up with ways to ameliorate something, but I think it's something that would always be there. It's just so fundamental the way people are, that, you tend to say we chef, because again, it's hard to have somebody who's always going off on their own. It's hard to make an organization work that way.
Mhm.
So, but in the end, the people going off on their own are the only ones who are going to find the mistakes and correct them, or the new innovative solutions. So the way the economy has worked is that's typically been those people who see the problems or see the opportunities, they leave and they start their own company. And then the big companies buy them up, And I think some of them, you see in some industries now where the corporate level R&D is basically being, suppressed, because you could just buy it up when you see it come up from outside, or try to fertilize it, and that, in your environment, some startups. Our company, someday I'll talk about it, is doing things like that. So there's all
Well,
kinds
a
of
lot
ways,
of
but I
companies,
really
a
don't see
lot
how
of
you get away
companies
from it.
are, they spring out a little group and they say, you go out and you innovate and
Yeah.
you build, and then we'll bring you back in if you're successful. If you're successful, we'll give you a big hit. We'll give you each $1 million, or give you each $2 million.
Yeah,
to make it
this is
happen.
this kind of a spin-off type of approach,
Yeah.
which I think makes some sense, and certainly can be more successful than, a bigger structure that, just has real trouble innovating. So anyway, these are all these issues that came up fundamentally from von Mises' work that made him the way Hulsmann put it, the last knight of liberalism, where liberalism was the old kind of liberalism of basically liberty and freedom. So this was a core tenet of von Mises' view of the world, but he also had kind of a utilitarian view. He certainly was not religious, and probably, atheist, and didn't see the moral aspects of things. And this was the note I sent to you was a letter from that book on Odyssey of a Friend, because Mises' book was Human Action was reviewed in National Review, and Chambers didn't think it was critical enough. But it really didn't even get at, he'd never read the book. And he was especially critical because Mises thought that the only thing driving the socialist was envy, which I think is something driving some socialists, or some people who get caught up in socialist movements. In other words, right now today, we can look at the gazillionaires and be envious of them and be against them. They should be taxed more, or think if we just had more of their wealth, we could do better things in the government. Those I see as problematic. But what we can see is there's a system that's been gamed that's not the market. And those people at the top, again, when everybody's world is collapsing, they're gaining more wealth than ever. There's something going on. And I think if you get into von Mises' book, von Mises' theories of understanding, a very fundamental, another great, you call it a finding, it's a discovery, it exists, and then he described it, was now called the Austrian business cycle theory, which is basing on how the booms and busts occur in the economy based on the falsification of money. Money was the accounting. We talked about how fundamental it was information flow. Well, if you degrade that and the information is now false, well, it will make the whole house of cards collapse.
Yeah, we're waiting to see what the quantitative easing of the last 3 or 4 years is going to do.
More than that, it's been, we just passed the 50th anniversary of the closing of the last connection to gold. by
Yes,
nature.
but I mean specifically, I mean, the trillions and trillions of dollars that have been pumped into the system in the last few years are gonna greatly.
But this is in Austrian business cycle theory is, as the boom continues, you got to pump more and more and more. Otherwise, it's still gonna collapse until eventually, you have we call the crack up boom, which he lived through in Austria, when the whole currency system collapses. So that's one of the ways to view current events is it's the currency collapse, and some way, they have to transition. They'll call them, Fed coins and digital or something. There's definitely the people have these ideas out there. They write papers and you can read them, but when you put it within the fundamental understanding of Austrian economics, it makes a lot more sense. So we're at that kind of point, certainly, but it's been something that has been inherent, I think, in the West for, certainly in the 20th century. I mean, we had I once went to a seminar with an economics professor, and he was really unpolitical, was not political at all. It was just giving a historic view of inflation. And he just had data, he had this, and you can imagine the difficulties in trying to measure inflation over time. So this was a US data from the 18th century before the revolution, and to the present. This was sometime in the 90s, 1990s. And you see basically a flat line for the value of the dollar was $20 an ounce of gold, 1/20th an ounce of gold for the 200 years through revolutions, civil wars. Now there were major inflations then. You see little blips, but compared to what happened since 1913, there are tiny blips, and the value, now it's gone up and down, but it's $1,800 an ounce compared to the $20 an ounce. So, that level of, and where those things occur, what in this inflation being a monetary phenomenon. And then you get to the point where von Mises recognized, and you can read about this in some of the, the German-speaking people of, say, in the 30s. Thomas Mann had a short story, is very good, and Stefan Zweig writes about this in his memoir about the effects of the inflation. When you're really living through, we can go now and probably talk to Venezuelans. When the currency is destroyed, the economy collapses, you're left to barter or something to find your way, and the social structure collapses at that point. This is the sense, it's such a terrible thing to do to people. And so, this is, how do you stay free? You protect your money in the sense, not your own money in your pocket, maybe, but in the sense of what that has real value and what it means is maintained and not so easy able to counterfeit. That's why counterfeiting is a crime. And so, this was one of the great ironies of George Floyd, was he was first stopped for passing a counterfeit $20 bill when the Fed was producing trillions, at the same time. So to me, these are the fundamental lessons of the Austrian economics. And when you take them farther, I had one last book here, and this is one of many, one of Mises' greatest students in New York. Again, Mises' story of how he escaped from Austria in the 30s and then finally made it to the US. And he was something like 60 years old, didn't speak English, and then wrote Human Action, learned English and wrote Human Action, like in the same period. I mean, it's incredible, his courage and fortitude. And his motto from Virgil was never, give in to evil. At the same time, in the 1940, early 40s, Stefan Zweig who I think is incredibly gifted writer and insightful, tremendous writer. I mean, there's so much to read in Zweig, who he had a very similar background, similar age, and in Vienna during this time, both were Jewish background, etc. Well, Zweig, committed suicide in Brazil because the world was just too terrible. And von Mises, had the fortitude to keep going. And now von Mises is read more today probably than he ever in his life. With things like Margit, with, there's a man named Lou Rockwell started a von Mises Institute. So all this writing is available online and people are reading it. So, there is a sense even in these times, I think, I literally go back to, well, what happened in 1940 in France? What would I do? Because I'm here in France. How would I get through it? Because it seems now we have to deal with making these tough decisions about how we're going to react to a government edict, say, or with our different ideas in the family, etc. Well, once von Mises was in the US, he ended up in New York, and his great student was a guy named Murray Rothbard. So this is his treatise, building on human action, putting things with some different types of examples, looking at more of the fundamental problems, like how do you deal with pollution? How do there's lots and lots, and it keeps going. And I think where I'd like to bring it back to some of the things in your channel that I've seen. Rothbard wrote a book on economic philosophy, the history of the economic philosophy, especially focusing on, where the proto-libertarian or Austrian school economists were through time. And what came from that book, from my reading it, was his, and he very specifically talks about this, of realizing those fundamental ideas rested on natural law.
Mm-hmm.
And he was Jewish background and an atheist. But it's evident when you search for it that there is these fundamentals about how humans are, to see the world, to see the way people are, and how they live socially, that developed certain axioms. You could do it in that way, say, do not kill from the 10 Commandments, or you can build them by the way von Mises looked at the economy and human action, that these are fundamental. And when we ignore them and break, say, the natural law in that way, the society won't flourish in any form that, we want to try to measure it. And, I think this is, for me, been a really interesting, was now confluence, because when I was first reading these books 30 years ago, it seemed to me there was a real separation between a von Mises and a Chambers, of kind of a secular view of what's going on in the world versus a moral Christian view of the world. And in many cases, somebody like the Bannock Mosquito, for example, in his blog, of where once you start really studying these things and looking at them seriously, they start to come together, and you see where they really fit together perfectly, because they're almost one and the same thing of trying.
Mm-hmm.
For me, when I talk about the Austrian economics, it's the fundamentally moral part of it, based on freedom, that's as important as the fundamental, say, utilitarian resources, optimization part that comes through just as importantly. And the calculation problem, I just the other day watched your discussion with the delightful woman philosopher, English philosopher,
Paula Boddington.
Boddington, yeah.
Boddington, yeah.
And and the trolley problem. And see, the trolley problem comes to me is exactly kind of the von Mises critique from the moral side, because the trolley problem is posed as we can calculate what's going to happen. We know the future. you do this or you do that. And it's total BS. It comes back to my thing. No, they don't. It's like when they say either so one of my classics to see trolley problems is, what are examples? Was that 60 Minutes with Madeleine Albright when she was interviewed and she was posed by Leslie Saul, 500,000 children have died in Iraq due to the sanctions that were posed on them. Now, I don't know if that number is correct, but Madeleine Albright's response was, we think it's worth it. We did the calculation. We had the trolley problem, and we decided that 500,000 kids could die so we could get our objective, which is more important, like weapons of mass destruction or something like that. And the other person you mentioned was Elizabeth Alscombe, the philosopher at that period. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know about her C.S. Lewis debate until much more recently. But what I knew her for was from years ago was that she had been very, very critical of, I guess it was Oxford, giving a honorary degree to Harry Truman because she was critical because he had made the decision to drop the bomb, or at least that's the decision was made and he's distributed to him. Well, there again is you see it's posed as the trolley problem. 1 million soldiers will die if we don't drop the bomb and kill these 100,000 innocent, civilians, women and children, whatever. But you can go through, these things and go, well, where are you getting that estimate from? Those are the only two choices? We had this, if they would have just said the emperor could live, they would have surrendered. But we said, no, there's no unconditional surrender. So the trolley problem, it's just filled with it's disgusting to me. You were showing that, but it's fundamentally is because you're predicting the truth and you don't know it, and you're limiting your choices, and those aren't the only choices. That's the top-down excuse for all these horrors that we're living through all the time.
Well, to bring that back,
give them to you, and they're one or the other.
To bring that back to Jordan Peterson, and I think this ties together von Mises and Chambers and Peterson as well, is that the ultimate evil arises out of the arrogance of believing that you know everything. You have all the information necessary, right? That's the ultimate evil. And there's a quote in Witness where Chambers says that Karl Marx said, philosophers have explained the world, but it is necessary to change the world. So what Marx is basically saying is, I know better than all the philosophers. I know better than anybody who's ever lived. I know that the world needs to be changed, and I know how to change it, and I'm going to make sure that it gets changed. So he knows everything. And Peterson always talks about Satan being
the Great Reset, these kind of things, it's hubris. And now it's in a technocratic way of saying, and posing like these are the problems and these are the choices and this is the solution to them. And to me, this is the classic trolley problem where the fundamental is they're making predictions about things that they can't back up. And if you look at them historically, you will see these predictions have been made. You can certainly go back to Malthus and go on and on and on and on, and every single time has been false.
Well, and the news media is complicit in training us to believe that there's only two options to everything. They have this, even when they want to be neutral, they'll have this side and that side. But wait, there's more than two options, right?
Yeah.
But you never see.
That's the sense of these are those are not my only options. As an individual, I have other options that I can make and society can make, and this is their imposing. So again, I think the things that you've been talking about on your channel, they can come together, and there are the aspects. Again, I think the first time I contacted you is because you had been talking about Austrian economics, and that was the first I heard it get into this corner of the internet. And then when I saw you had Chambers' book there, again, Witness was a very important book for me. And those things milling around, and now even Peterson recognizing Austrian economics, I think is an interesting turn of how, again, I think they're fundamental parts of the human condition. You know, it's also what makes great art too, I would say, you know, that which from, you know, that comes together and you see, you know, there is a human condition, there's truth to it. You know, the Soviets wanted to make a new man and wipe it away what was the human condition to something else. Well, this is the modern, you know, great danger, it seems, keeps coming back. Maybe that's what it is, that somebody can say, oh, this is a new way of doing everything. And we see it at our peril of what that's going to be, in a way that, you know, Weinsteins have been talking a lot about, you know, Chesterton's fence. You know, so if you wipe away all the limits and you can't explain, well, why those limits were there, you know, maybe you're going to unleash something that you didn't recognize was a danger. And I think try to pinpoint those things throughout modern society as being the minimum, something we haven't figured out what a new limit has to be. Because again, there has to be limits or boundaries, as you like to talk about so much in the various parts of your channel, between physics, art, and our basic lives. I mean, we have a limit on how much we can eat. We have a limit on just, there's so many things that.
Well, see, that's the whole thing. I think that it fundamentally comes down to this denial of reality.
Yeah.
Because when you talk about natural law, and I was having this conversation, I was trying to explain myself to Bionic Mosquito in an email. It's always difficult to write things out because it's easier for me to talk about it. But, you know, when Jesus says, I am the truth, the way, and the life, that word truth actually is the word aletheia, which in the Greek means reality. So he's basically saying, I am the reality. And if you align with me, if you line up, if you draw close to me and become one with me, I am the reality. And he is, I mean, you could call it natural law if you want to. There is a way things are. And if we adhere to the way things are, then not that life will be perfect, because there is always chaos, there's always catastrophe, there's always disaster. But it will be better for us, you know. And Jordan Peterson always says, speak the truth, or at least don't lie, because what comes when you speak the truth is that which will be the best of all possible worlds.
But you could also add Paget's patterns there, you know, as again, a part of reality that manifests themselves.
And I wanted to just quote again from Witness, because there's just so much good stuff in here. When he was finally coming to the place where he was recognizing that there was evil, and in fact that communism was the greatest evil. And the reason it was the greatest evil is that it was attempting to say that there is no need for God, and attempting to force people to agree that there is no need for God. Even though he himself had not seen the need for God, all of a sudden, when he recognized this problem with evil, he realized that something was missing. And he said, I asked at last, can it be God? I associated God with ill-ventilated vestries and ill-ventilated minds. How could it be God? Yet if it was just as evil to kill the Tsar as to kill 2 million peasants, it was evil because a violence had been committed against the soul of the murderer as well as of the murdered. And he goes on to say that as I tried to pray, it was as if that spirit from my boyhood and youth took my hand and knelt and prayed beside me, so that in the act of seeking oneness with God, I became one with myself. I just wish people could read this book. There's so much good stuff in here. And he goes on to say, I cannot say I changed, but there tore through me a transformation with the force of a river, which dammed up and diverted for a lifetime, burst its way back to its true channel. I became what I was. I ceased to be what I was not. What I had been fell away from me like dirty rags. The rags that fell from me were not only communism. What fell was the whole web of the materialist modern mind, the luminous shroud which it has spun about the spirit of man, paralyzing in the name of rationalism the instinct of his soul for God, denying in the name of knowledge the reality of the soul and its birthright in that mystery on which mere knowledge falters and shatters at every step. I mean, he goes on and on. It's just really good stuff.
I agree. So, this you can rank, I think, Witness is one of the great books of the 20th century. In a different way, Human Action is one of the great intellectual books, that tries to not be this technical little thing, but try to put it all together and explain it of a field as wide as human action, but in terms of especially economics, that again, well, I don't know what's being taught in schools anymore. I mean, I've been away from academia for a long time, but it doesn't seem like to be a good place these days. So I'm not sure what's being taught. Certainly when you say, Peterson has gone on about people don't even know any of the history of the Soviet Union. This is problematic, I would say, in terms of a pretty recent event that have occurred, that affecting us still today.
Well, that's been going on forever, though. I mean,
Yeah.
I went to college in the late 60s. They taught us a lot about Nazism, but they never talked about the dangers of the Soviet system or all the millions of people who had died under Stalin, or they never talked about any of that. But I mean,
it's one of the things, subject for another day, but my friend Ruth Matthews, at the time I met her, she was trying to work on a biography of him. And he was a very interesting person, had been in all these kind of social justice movements and things, and had been a man of the left. He was like a zealot. He'd met everybody, these incredible of people he was involved with, but ended up being a witness for this House Un-American Activities Committee. And I would say he was the first kind of credible witness that they had. This was in the late 30s.
Now, Ruth's husband, James?
JB.
Yeah.
Joseph Brown Matthews.
Oh, JB.
He's not so well known today, but at that moment, he was on the cover of all the newspapers. Because one of the things he was saying, like, people were dupes of these things, and the communists were using names. So it was one of the little things that happened then was he had mentioned among several movie stars that Shirley Temple's name was being used in the communist press. And so in the Roosevelt administration, they didn't, of course they had several communist spies, working at the time, but they were more left wing. And they spun the story to say Matthews accuses Shirley Temple of being a communist. This was the spin on the story. It was a great original spin job, of how you could take the story and what you present. And he went all the way through, and then he became like the lead investigator on that committee, and up until the mid 40s, and also so many things with that. And then after that became kind of a professional anti-communist. And so in that little passage I read, they kept kind of a salon in New York of sort of anti-communist activists, writers and things, many people of different stripes and in different situations. And then at that time, again, say now, especially it's controversial, they became quite close to Joseph McCarthy. And McCarthy asked Matthews to join his committee. And one of the things you'll hear people get wrong all the time they'll talk about the House Un-American Activities Committee and then talk about Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was Senator Joe McCarthy. He was not in the House. He was on that committee, but he was on a government affairs committee, and his big thing was to be accusing government employees of being communist agents. Now, how many he accused and his method of accusations is something to critique, especially in this day and age when people are, but certainly many of them were communist agents, or however dangerous that was. That's another deeper question to go on. So anyway, the last time then JB was famous was he was asked by McCarthy to be like this lead investigator. And if you might know how controversial and people involved, the lead investigator for McCarthy was Roy Cohn, this infamous lawyer, and Robert Kennedy, was another one of the lawyers and investigators on, working at that time.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then within 2 weeks they found another old article he had written, or an article he had written previously about how many ministers and priests, were essentially followed the communist line, wittingly or unwittingly. And so in the press, they came out that he's he says all the ministers in the United States are this good proportion are communist. And so this controversy came, and he weighed the things, and he getting up in age and decided to resign after only a couple weeks in that role of officially trying to helping McCarthy. But this was really probably the first big defeat of McCarthy, and really signaled where he was going to be attacked and destroyed, which was what happened. But in that story, what Ruth told me about, one of the frequent guests at that time was Ayn Rand in Europe. And Rand was just adamant that Matthews shouldn't resign. And if you've ever heard her speak and you just read what she writes, even, she's such a personality that at that point they couldn't put up with her anymore. It's not like the last time that they invited her over. She was too much. Anyway, those personal parts are really interesting to me, and something I've done some research on, another story sometime. But the whole milieu of it, putting it together, I think, in a way, is necessary to try to really understand what's going on in the world of things like Austrian economics, things like this deep history. Because otherwise, there is so much information flowing by you don't even know how to. Most people I know, I don't think really have the tools to try to put together what is true and not true and understand what's happening. I certainly wouldn't have if I think I hadn't spent, 2 or 3 decades now, informally. I've never taken a class in any of this, but sitting with the books and trying to go through and understand these concepts.
I came at these two authors kind of in the opposite direction from you, because back in the late 70s, when our economy was disintegrating rapidly at the end of Carter's term in office, I was in my late 20s, and I was kind of terrified at what I saw happening around me. And so I started reading everything I could get my hands on. And a lot of it was maybe stuff on the stock market and how they were expecting that there was a lot of catastrophizing about how the stock market was going to spike and then it was going to collapse, and a lot of survival stuff about how you should be stocking up your closets with tuna fish and toilet paper, and I did all that because I wanted to be prepared, because I really felt there was a big crash coming. But I was also trying to work towards some political resolution. So I was helping out with the candidacies of various people going into the election of 1980. And of course, that's when Reagan was elected, and he took some steps to make changes. But during all that time, I'm reading these stock market books. I'm starting to read economics, and then I got elected in the 1980 wave. I got elected to the legislature. And because of that, I was invited to the Foundation for Economic Education to come for a week of study, and had an opportunity to sit under some fabulous economists. And I don't know if all of them were from the Austrian school, but I still remember the seminars from Israel Kirzner.
Yeah, pretty close. Kirzner is
Yeah.
one of the really well-known Austrian.
Yeah.
I think he actually attended Mises seminar in New York. If I'm
And
not
this was
mistaken.
just right. I mean, this was leading up to and just after I became a Christian that I was so interested in economics. So the economics kind of drove me towards faith, I think. And then I started out with a rational decision to become a Christian, but then as I began to study in Bible studies with women and everything, it just began to open up to me like, oh my gosh, this isn't just a decision I make. This is truth. This is reality. This is the way the world is, right? And it wasn't until maybe 10 years ago that I read Witness. I can't remember why I picked it up. Probably had something to do with what was going on in the political environment at that time or something. But I started reading it, and for me, it was kind of a reminder of all the things that I had read in my earlier years in politics and everything, because I had read and studied a lot about what had been going on in the Soviet Union. I had read a lot of background on Ayn Rand. And so it wasn't like it was new to me, but it was a wonderful reliving of all of that history of what went on in the 30s and 40s. And very much in the same way, a few years after that, I read, what's his name? Eric Metaxas's book on Bonhoeffer. Have you read that?
I have not.
Because
I know
that's
about
it's the same
mentioned that
time
about-
period. It's the early 30s going into the 40s, but over on the Nazi side. And so
Yeah.
getting the history of what was happening during the world at that time from these two men that lived through it.
The one that I've read that fits more in the mold very much of, say, von Mises and then Zweig, and was a philosopher, a Jewish woman named Edith Stein. And she was actually born in, was like a German patriot. I mean, she was a volunteer nurse during the First War, and then was voted into the Polish side. Where she was the first one was on the border, but she became the top student of Edmund Husserl.
Oh,
And
really? I didn't
around
realize
his
that.
group, so I was really interested.
Wasn't she in with all those artists and Hemingway and all those people too? Or is that a
No,
different?
no, that's a different.
That's a different Edith.
Yeah.
Okay.
Looks like the cat's here. Oh, what? And so, but Husserl, and actually I didn't realize how much some of this in studying Stein, but Husserl, was part of a group, was the leader of a group that was kind of coming to, phenomenology, and it was from like a Catholic perspective. And some of these other students and professors and around Husserl became Catholic. And there was a book written, I found this out because actually Dallas Willard, who Paul.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that Dallas
wrote some
Willard.
great stuff about that. I mean,
Dallas Willard was a great student of Husserl too. So.
But Edith Stein, she then again came from this. So this is Oli, mischievous. Every time I try to talk to anybody, and she became was said like the top assistant for Husserl, and around this time then became Catholic. And of course, she's a Jewish German, but now Catholic. PhD and etc. But she couldn't get a teaching job, not in the 30s. But anyway, her faith continued to grow, and she ended up joining the Carmelites as a nun. And then in the mid 30s, they sent her to the Netherlands because of all the danger. And of course, then the Netherlands was captured. And then I think it was in the 40s, 43, I think, there was several different denominations read a letter in the Sunday to the about the treatment of the Jews in the Netherlands. And the Nazis, what they did against that was then to take people who had been converted from Judaism. And Stein and her sister, who was with her, were one of them. They took her out of the convent, and she was sent to Auschwitz and was killed. But she's now been, under John Paul II, was beatified and is made a saint of the church. So it follows, this path of, as a philosopher, I can't assess her as a philosopher itself. I don't think I have enough of the background for that, but her memoirs and things are really, was very moving, interesting to me in how she passed in that life.
Well, that's it's that kind of courage that certainly typifies all of these people that we're talking about, because I think Jordan Peterson, Whittaker Chambers, Edith Stein, Ludwig von Mises, because when you stand up against the onslaught of everything that is thrown at you, and we're certainly in that world today. I mean, okay, maybe getting slaughtered by Twitter isn't the same thing as the kind of thing that they were under. But even to stand up against that is very painful and difficult, and
especially when your career blows away. I mean, that's something for a lot of people. And it's, I had wondered when I was younger, how, and tried to even say, is like, compared to Peterson saying, well, I would be a resistance fighter. I said, well, I don't know if I'd have the courage to do that. It seems like we're going to the point where we're going to have to live through these things again, unfortunately, that depressions and all these things that I thought happened in the 30s, and 40s, which culturally for me, that's what I find. I was born in end of the baby boom, but I never caught on culturally to the 60s. I mean, I never bought a rock music record or anything for some reason, no. And I was too interested in things like baseball, but used to watch like old, the TV, that, limited TV, but they had old movies on. So all the movies that I used to see were from the 30s and 40s. So that's where I felt more at home culturally. So
that's why I resonate so much with you, because I grew up, we didn't really have a TV until I was probably, I want to say 10 or 11 maybe. And at that point, it was my task to do the ironing for the household. And back in those days, we used to iron the sheets and the pillowcases and all the pants and shirts. And that was my job, especially in the summer. And so the TV would have on all these old movies all the time. The 40s, 30s and 40s. I fell in love with those movies. I fell in love with that era. I always felt I had been born into the wrong era.
Yeah.
I used to get the jackets with the big padded shoulders and
definitely a different kind of thing. Even the music, I like the big band sound a lot.
Yeah, Linda Darnell. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Betsy, what was her name? The blonde, funny comedian. There's some great stuff from that era.
Yeah.
Gene Kerr. Yep. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yeah, all those.
But so many of those old movies, like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and what's the Christmas one?
Wonderful Life.
A Wonderful Life. Those are all really kind of communist propaganda.
Well,
when you look at them the right way.
There was definitely some real propaganda. There's been several books. Ruth actually was on a committee about what was going on in the movies and the battles among the different actors. Of course, Reagan came out of some of that, but John Wayne and definitely things going on. But I think there was the core of who were the movie moguls at the time, who were mainly, I think, Jewish, immigrant stock, who had a vision of what America was that they were promoting, that was to build up America in a kind of a positive way. You get positive. Bing Crosby was a priest, and you had several kinds of films like that. Even A Wonderful Life, there's the immigrant families and the different people involved that switched to say whatever that vision was, that was a corrupt image, and to tear it down. And they've done a good job of tearing that down. You could find things to criticize of that image for sure, but what's remaining after tearing it down, I think you could find a lot worse. Find to be a lot worse.
That's true.
Yeah.
I mean, A Wonderful Life still gives me a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling every time I watch it.
Yeah.
But the part of it that I'm saying is kind of propaganda is this idea that the banker is the evil guy. It's always the banker. It's always the guy in the suit is the evil guy.
That was, I mean, it wasn't totally that way. Certainly in Wonderful Life, the banker is the heavy, though, of course, Jimmy Stewart is a kind of a local banker as well. The loan is a different kind of thing. What's not shown there, one thing is, they find money and they don't give it back. That's, in a sense, theft. So it's not an honest banker, which, again, I'm not sure in the film where an honest banker is depicted, what honest banking would be. But in our fiat money system, we don't really have honest banking. And this is the great danger. I mean, this is what's one of the things driving so much, I think, is bad in society, is the dishonest money basically goes through banks. And so they're given the power, to do the things, or where all that money goes, to have wars, to put in place a system to fight a pandemic that's totally unrealistic, shutting down the economy. The only way it works is by creating money and placating, millions of people. So there are all these kind of things that happen that now, probably more than ever, you really can just be safe on saying the banker is where the corruption lies. So,
well, I guess
what's his name again? The director, I can't. The name is escaping me.
Frank Capra.
Capra, yeah, Frank Capra.
Yeah, he was. I think Jimmy Stewart was representing the kind of a banker that I always heard about growing up. Is that the good banker, his role is to make sure that the money that is put under his care is lent out in order to make a good return, so that he can give a return to the people who are putting the money in the bank. And then he takes that money and he lends it out to people who are a decent risk, but that also provides money for starting businesses, or for people to buy farms, or for people to buy homes. And so there is a good side to it. The role of distributing capital in an efficient way is critical. It's definitely helps build the economy and society. It's the fact of how easily, or now certainly is corrupted, that is so dangerous. Because again, right now they don't even care about people depositing money. That's not where the money comes from. Well, yeah, I mean, now we're in some countries, we're even looking at negative interest rate. You have to pay them to keep your money for you. So
yeah, so it does. Yeah, it doesn't make any. That's not physical. That's not reality. So again, what's going to happen?
Maybe sometime we need to do an episode on the Fed, because I've been hearing about this my whole life, And I have so many questions about it. And it sounds like you know something about the Fed. I'd like to learn from you.
Yeah. There's some interesting things going on about the Fed. I think it's probably about time to.
Yeah. We don't want to get into that
And
now. It's too big a subject.
I was just gonna say though, this is being filmed. We're doing this on Tuesday, and there's one of the places. And this is really now getting talk about a problem that people are having around the world. I'm having is there's way too much content. I can't keep up with all the Peterson, with you and Paul. It's just too much. And I see now that one of the people I started following, there's a particular lawyer named Robert Barnes, and he's a real character, but quite good on a lot of subjects. And he's going to be interviewing Michaela Peterson. Well, him and his partner, this guy, Canadian lawyer. So he takes things from a legal perspective usually, but then I'm waiting to see that. And that would be an interesting one of, where the little community, this corner of the internet diffuses out into other parts of where you see part of the internet. I mean, it's really interesting, like the bionic mosquito that you mentioned, somebody's blog I followed for a long time. He would be a great one for you to get. He's always anonymous, but I'd love to hear him speaking and talking. I think I've mentioned to him in emails to probably go on your program or something.
Well, yeah, but he's reluctant up to this point. Yeah. He's reluctant. So he mainly talks by email.
Yeah. But anyway, where all these things are going, we hear Peterson's name, almost everywhere now, if possible, and all these different things. So anyway, yeah, always open for more conversation. I've been try to follow your channel as much as I can, but I've missed a couple here and there, but have been relatively keeping up.
Well, it's always good talking to you, Ira.
Yeah.
And I'll put the names of all these books that you mentioned online, and I'll also put Whittaker Chambers Witness, which is just such a beautiful book. It's not an easy book, and there's a lot of information in there, which may seem like more information than what a person wants.
Well, it's all the details that he wants to do of making his case.
Yeah.
If you're not familiar with it, it's really going to seem kind of, what is all this about? So you get a lot of background to understand. There's also a biography of Chambers that came out a few years ago. I could 15, 20 years ago now. That was, I found it mediocre, I would say, but it's against some more information. I'd have to go get it out.
I think even if you just could read the first 100 pages, you would get.
Yeah, I think that letter to his children at the beginning is worthwhile. Yeah. I think the book of his journalism is quite nice. There's a lot of articles there that are, I don't know what's online these days about him. I haven't looked lately, but there could be some good things out there.
Yeah, and I'll also post the documentary about Ludwig von Mises, because I thought it was pretty helpful. Goes through some of the history of what was happening when he was getting started. So this has been great, Ira. Thank you so much for being willing to be part of this and have fun with the cat.
Yeah, he's going wild right now. You hear him. Yeah. Okay, take care of whatever's going on. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.